So it's now day 13 since my return to Canada after 11 years in the US. In response to my recently posted double exit interview with Jay, who is, after having left the US, now in Sweden, I was asked about and criticized for my prior support of Trump. That will be the focus of this video. So, to be clear, I was never a die-hard Trumper by any means. I never went to a Trump event or owned any MAGA merch. But I was happy when he won in 2016, though I didn't support him leading up to it. And I would have voted for him in 2020. To understand how I got there after years of being on the left, it's necessary to understand where I came from. So I grew up in and around Toronto. I was raised by a single mother who is a brown refugee from Uganda. We didn't have a lot of money. Part of the reason for that was that my father was genuinely, truly, and fully, utterly useless. A terrible, absent, low to no effort father. Growing up, the people that I could count on were almost exclusively women. My mother, my grandmother, my stepmom, and my aunt primarily. My mom was and is a strong woman, self reliant, firm in her convictions, very hardworking. She could have gone on social assistance. My father paid next to no child support, so she could have absolutely got it. We could have been in subsidized housing and so forth, maybe out of pride, and but also because she wanted to, I guess, set an example for me. She refused to do either of those things, never doing it once for a moment. She worked her ass off. She worked full time. She raised me largely by herself for most of my childhood. She worked out, she cooked, she cleaned, she did it all. During my childhood, money was always an issue. But despite this, I never for 1 second felt that this would be my destiny. As I would sometimes tell Americans when I was down there, I felt that the American dream was perhaps more accessible to me in Canada than it would have been in the United States. The reason being is that despite our limited finances, we would never be at risk of financial ruin due to health related issues. And critically, I would never have any financial barriers to going to an excellent university. The only thing that could stop me from going to an excellent university was whether or not I could get in based on merit and merit alone. And like many of my friends growing up who were also often first generation Canadians or immigrants themselves, and many of them, like me, were of limited financial means, we pursued that upward mobility. We worked hard in school to get into university, we worked hard in university, and many of us came out the other side eventually to enjoy significant upward mobility. And that is something that I will always be grateful to Canada for. I always grew up in an untraditional family, whether it be being with a single mother or once my mother remarried with a stepfather. On top of this, we were not religious. And me personally, I was an edgy kid, a prankster, a joker, and someone who enjoyed pushing the boundaries of acceptable social behavior. I was also bullied a lot as a kid, which to this day makes me extremely sensitive to any sort of domineering behavior. In my mid 20s, I would become actively and heavily involved in the left leaning atheist movement. All of this put me at odds with the stodgy, overtly religious, traditionalist, social program slashing conservatism of the time. I was secular, I identified as a feminist on egalitarian grounds, biracial, and half my friends weren't white. I cheered on those who were slaughtering the sacred cows of the conservative scolds of the day. I had progressive blogs. I was at the Toronto iteration of Occupy Wall Street. I watched the Young Turks daily. I was also very ambitious. I took my education extremely seriously. I took intellectual rigor extremely seriously. I was in very competitive programs at the University of Toronto, wherein if a person were to make a comment that could be picked apart, it would be picked apart. And this trained me into being extremely conscious of making sure that I consider my opinions from a multitude of angles just to be able to hold up to scrutiny. In terms of my politics, this has always had the effect of keeping me moderate. when I was on the left, I could look at things from the perspectives of the right, and I could often see a level of validity, and often significant validity, though not always. Likewise, when I eventually shifted to the moderate right, the same applied to the left, and so there was only so far left or right I could ever really go. From the early 2000s until around 2013, I was very much at home on the left. But in 2013, I began noticing a set of very concerning shifts in the culture of the left. This started in the atheist community, where a rift over intersectional feminism tore the community apart. When this began, I was on the side of the feminists. I identified as a feminist, I was and I am an egalitarian, I'm biracial, I have many non-white friends. Of course I was on their side, but not blindly so. Despite being on their side, I would still ask questions and offer alternative perspectives to my fellow feminists. This rarely went well. Over and over again, I had the worst assumptions made about me and my motivations, and no amount of clarification of my values would ever be enough to convince them of my goodwill. It was so hostile that most people in the community were highly reluctant to comment, particularly if it would be in any way contrary or even questioning of the positions of the more avid feminists in the group, who tended to be the most vocal and active, of course. We were a community that spent years saying that you do not have a right to not be offended. After all, we were atheist activists. Few people were slaughtering sacred cows of our culture more than we were. Yet suddenly, easily, half of our community was self-neutering at the altar of intersectional feminism. If a creationist were to enter one of our forums or come to one of our events, they'd and offer their opinions on, creation versus evolution, they would easily have half a dozen or more atheists on them, picking apart everything they said, pointing out things as pedantic as misplaced commas. But apparently there was no limit to the amount of flaws that could be in the argument of a feminist in our midst that many of these sane people would stay silent about. By 2014, this social justice movement, which began on university campuses, would destroy the atheist community, ending its heyday. But it would not remain localized to this community. In 2014, as the atheist community was burning out, it would shoot an ember into the gaming community that would bloom into what became known as Gamergate. It was essentially the same situation, just different venue, same outcome. Division over conflicts regarding feminism and social justice. This would then bleed into the 2016 U.S. electoral arena, facilitated by people like Milo Yiannopoulos and Sargon of Akkad, and that would quickly become a global, total cultural phenomenon, having massive impacts on all scales of politics, workforces, academia at every level, social media culture and policy, and more. And to be clear, my issue was never with social justice itself. It was with a feminism that would claim to be about equality, but only address inequalities where women and girls were or could be framed as being on the shorter end of the stick, blaming all inequality and adverse female experience on anti-female sexism. There is perhaps no better example of this than the wage gap, which has been continually inflated and misrepresented so as to create the impression that two people of equal merit doing the same job will have a pay disparity of roughly 23% based on nothing more than what happens between their legs. There would be no talk of males and females tending to be oriented towards different fields, working different hours, being more or less willing to relocate, to do more or less scalable work, to be in more uncomfortable or dangerous work environments for a pay premium, to negotiate pay, or any other personal choice consideration. None of this, by the way, is to say that discrimination is nothing. It's simply to say that women, like men, have agency, and that they don't always share the same interests and values as males, and some of these differences impact income. Meanwhile, despite claims about being about gender equality, Feminist orgs would all but never talk about issues that disproportionately adversely affected males, and when they did, they would of course put the blame on men and only men, as if males are the only people with agency. Concurrently, there was the racial justice movements that treated all white people like they were callous, oppressive, cultural aristocrats, insisting that any and all, for example, black-white disparities, were due to racism and racism alone. The onus for resolving inequalities would be put exclusively on the shoulders of white people and institutions. The mere idea of asking what can people from this or that minority group do to improve their lives beyond protesting, for example, was considered just flat out unacceptable. Consider black white income and crime rate disparities. Why must the conversation begin and end with considerations of personal and institutional racism and never consider things such as single parenthood rate among black people, which are at higher rates than in other groups? I mentioned earlier that I had an awful father, and so I essentially was raised by one parent. I suffer adverse consequences of this to this day. They will not end. Not having a good father would seriously harm anyone. If we're trying to help people, in this case black people, why would we not want to talk about this? As I said in my discussion with Jay, I'm not saying that racism and sexism don't exist and don't matter. Of course they do. But I don't want to look only on one side of the ledger. Yes, consciousness raising about isms matter. Yes, I want people to be judged on the content of their character, not their immutable characteristics. But at the end of the day, usually, the person and those closest to them will be their best advocates. And that is something I do not want to take the emphasis off. Not that it should only be on that, but that is absolutely indispensable. Indeed, one of the things that has bothered me about the left, at least during this period, is a greatly exaggerated externalization of locus of control for absolutely everybody but straight white men. Personal responsibility matters. Community matters. Grit matters. And it's not bigoted to say this. If anything, it's demeaning to ask for far less from non-straight white males as one is asking of straight white males. This is not progressive. This is straight white male supremacy with a halo and a guilty conscience. It's treating straight white men like they were somewhere between human and malevolent demigod, and women and minorities as if they were somewhere between human and house pet. That is not helping. Throughout all of this, many, many people on the left were and have been afraid to speak out against the excesses of this vocal segment of the community. But then there were people like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin, people with roots on the left who were speaking out against what was happening on their own side. They were speaking to overblown identity politics that was taking over the left, the intolerance of dissent, the censoriousness in left-leaning communities and social media. When I saw people like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin criticizing the left and giving credit to people on the right, I actually viewed it as integrity. It's like, look, they're willing to criticize their own side, unlike so many others on that side who were being silent, and to give credit to conservatives where it's due. Like, isn't that what you want? Is, to be honest and fair. I would also watch people like Shapiro and Crowder on the right, because unlike most of the people on my side, they were at least willing to point out the craziness on it. They would emphasize things like grit and personal responsibility, which are things I've always valued. And they, along with people like Milo, they were having fun. They were now the ones slaughtering the sacred cows, effectively taking on the mantle of Rage Against the Machine and saying, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me. And then there was Trump. Trump was also pointing out and thumbing his nose at the excesses of the social justice left. He was also either actively supported by, treated with mild positivity, or at least with neutrality by many, if not most, of the voices that I was following. Further, he was hated by the very people I found to be the most insufferable. the new cultural scolds that, in my view, had torched the atheist community. But it wasn't just that. My first red pill moment would actually come significantly earlier and was provided to me by none other than Barack Obama, who I really liked. I had great hope in him. I was so happy when he won, and he let me down massively. And I mean this from a progressive perspective. I thought he would actually fight for things like accessible, affordable healthcare. Instead, despite having the Senate and the House, he compromised on top of compromise to establish a profoundly watered down bill, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, which was, as much as anything, a massive gift to the health insurance lobby. He did not go after the war criminals of the Bush administration because he was looking forward, not back. He did not shut down Guantanamo. He did nothing to address the corrosive role of money in politics. He was one giant disappointment. I quickly came to see that the only reason that any of us even knew his name was that he had made it very clear to party insiders and donors that President Obama and Campaign Obama are very different people. Had the DNC and donors had any sense that President Obama would bear any more than a passing resemblance to Campaign Obama, he would have received the Bernie Sanders treatment: marginalization, deprioritization, and getting flat out buried. It was here that I lost all confidence in the DC establishment. Obama was, by all appearances, our best case scenario. A young, apparently progressive, mixed race, hyper-educated person who came from a middle-class background and appeared to be a real fighter. If he can't break through, who can? It certainly wasn't going to be Hillary Clinton, who was as much of a DC swamp creature as anyone. Which leads us back to Trump. Trump was a DC outsider who was already exorbitantly wealthy and uniquely able to generate excessive amounts of free press. This, I felt, could make him less susceptible to the corrupting forces of DC. If he's less dependent on campaign donations, if he doesn't actually need a career in politics in order to be rich and famous, maybe he'll be less corrupt. By the same token, that could be said about The Rock or Oprah, for example. Yes, of course, he's a massive narcissist, but maybe he'll endeavor to be a good president if for no reason other than the glorification of his massive ego and desire to be praised and admired. Now, some, of course, will say, really? You thought this criminal, Trump, was going to be less corrupt? Fair enough. Back to Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, and the like. At this point, I'm still avidly following them and falsely believing that they are disaffected liberals who are willing to criticize their own side and give credit when it's due to the other, because look at all that integrity. One thing I've been asked and criticized about repeatedly of late is how I could have looked the other way on, for example, the grab 'em by the pussy, they let you when you're rich, and E. Jean Carroll situations. These were the sorts of things that received minimal coverage in my sources, and when they were covered, it would be brief, minimizing, and dismissive. And by this point, after years of watching people on the identity politics left magnify, distort, and in some cases even flat out fabricate cases of female victimhood, the boy who cried wolf effect was fully in effect. My interpretation of the grab 'em by the pussy, they let you when you're rich incident was akin to rock stars and pro athletes having women throw themselves at them. That's how I interpreted that. On the E. Jean Carroll front, my sources simply didn't talk about it very much, and when they did, it wasn't favorably. I didn't know what I wasn't hearing, and I'd lost so much trust in my prior lefty sources that I'd stopped listening to them. Consequently, the truth is that, to this day, I have massive blind spots from the entire first Trump term. I'll get back to this. As a result of all this, in 2016, I looked into Trump as someone that maybe I could actually support. I decided to watch a Trump rally. I put it on for a few minutes and I had to turn that crap off. I saw him criticizing one of his primary opponents for how they ate their ravioli. In that moment, it was very clear to me, this is not a serious person. I cannot support this. This would have been many months before the election. By the time the election came around, and I'd seen some of the debates and so forth, and then Trump won. I'm not going to lie. Out of, I would say, 3 parts Schadenfreude and 1 part open curiosity as to how maybe things could positively be different by a non-insider being president, I was excited. Over the next few years, my preferred political commentators, of course, would never criticize him or shine light on things that he did that were untoward, and so my blind spot would become more and more saturated. But toward the end of his first term, I finally started getting a sense that people like Tim Pool were not being anywhere remotely close to as balanced as I thought they were. I mean, on a weekly basis, he'd be saying things like that Democrats are in panic mode, yet 3 or 4 years later, after these weekly claims, roughly speaking, that they were in panic mode, they didn't really seem to be panicking. And, all these people hate Trump. Why have I not heard a single significant critical story about him in my sources? Like, clearly the left, even though I thought they were being a little out there at that time, like, even broken clocks are right twice a day. How has there not been anything? So in an effort to rebalance, I started watching a video a day by someone on the left. The Young Turks, David Pakman, Kyle Kulinski, Jimmy Dore were the main ones. And though unbeknownst to me, Jimmy Dore by this point was apparently trying to be every Trump supporter's favorite lefty. And so he would only slow down my sort of awakening. But having said that, even still, during the first week of me watching a video a day by a lefty YouTuber, I came across 2 stories that were significantly embarrassing for Trump that none of my regular sources said a word about. So this was creating a new level of doubt in me about Trump that I hadn't had in a couple of years. But, soon thereafter, the 2020 election came around, and I was still rooting for him to win. I hadn't seen enough yet to flip. And it also didn't help that his opponent was already showing cognitive decline, had claimed he was inspired to run by what was actually a hoax, the very fine people line, and had come from the very administration that had painfully taught me not to trust DNC-endorsed candidates. Trump, of course, would go on to lose, and I really didn't appreciate his post-election behavior. Before January, I had already shifted to, if he runs again and the Dem Party runs another uninspiring candidate and I have citizenship by the time of the next election, I will stay home. I was no longer in support of Trump, but I wasn't yet a never-Trumper. After the election, I followed politics far less. As a result, I wouldn't learn about the fake elector scheme until fully 3 years after it happened. A friend of mine told me about it. I would spend 10, 12 hours over the next several days reading about it, and this is what made me a never-Trumper. I would immediately go on to start making amends. I would bring up the fake electors scheme with many people, and I would do it from a position of embarrassment. I would be like, oh, you're not going to believe this. I'm so embarrassed, but I just learned about the fake elector scheme 2 weeks ago. Here was the really shocking part. Most of the Americans that I mentioned this to had no idea what I was talking about, including ones that didn't like Trump. In the 8 or so months leading up to the 2024 election, I would go on to make several posts on my own personal Facebook about the fake elector scheme, and I would initiate dozens upon dozens of conversations on the topic. I was trying to make amends, and I was trying to help people learn what I had learned. And when I had realized how few people apparently knew, I kind of took it very seriously to I gotta put this word out. I was wrong to ever support him. The DC system was intolerably corrupt, but he was not the solution. He merely made it truly intolerably corrupt.